Okay, I'm going to start. Hazal, okay?
Yes, sure, Fatih Bey.
Okay.
The floor is yours. Thanks.
So, dear TÜSİAD members, distinguished participants, I would like to thank for joining our third session of the 360-degree Green Deal training seminar series initiated by TÜSİAD Green Deal Task Force. As you well know, we have implemented this series of meetings in order to create awareness on various components of the European Green Deal and create opportunity to enable the exchange of ideas with participation of estimated speakers in the related fields. In this third event of the series, we will focus on Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which aims to enable large companies to report in more detail on non-financial issues such as environmental, social, human rights, and governance in the coming period. I would like to firstly welcome our distinguished speakers, Charlotte Anders' daughter, who is the International Director at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, Björn Wedin, who is the Trade Policy Advisor at the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. As increasing legislative acts on due diligence and sustainability reporting are on the legislative agenda of European and national policymakers, companies are putting much more efforts to integrate ESG targets into their business plans. EU's corporate sustainability due diligence legislation and local initiatives such as German supply chain law will push companies to re-examine their global supply chain in more detail in terms of human rights and the environment. German supply chain law, which is now effective as of 2023, presents the basic criteria and supplier audit standards that should be considered at all stages of the supply chain of companies located and operating in Germany. These initiatives will definitely have a global impact considering the interconnected value chains. There are also pioneering actions taken by private sectors to integrate ESG risks into their corporate strategies. Considering various and separate legislative developments, we need to also discuss effective harmonization and consistency of requirement among them. Only in the EU, there are many different regulations linked with the due diligence reporting at value chain, such as EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, Forced Labor Regulation Initiative, Deforestation Act, etc. These will all require companies to take concrete actions down their value chain. In case separate and conflicting reporting requirements will be put on force, these will have negative impact on supply chain by creating bureaucratic burden, fragmentation, and disruptions. In addition to these risks, when we also consider the global challenging business environment and transformation of supply chains associated with increase in energy scarcity and difficulties in raw material supplies, we find it highly critical to ensure common standards and reporting requirements in this field. The businesses around Europe call for a clear, harmonized, and business-friendly approach that avoids over-regulation while facilitating investments that would enhance competitiveness of Europe. This should be seen as a key action point for strengthening Europe's open strategic autonomy. We hope that Swedish presidency of the Council of European Union will be an opportunity to adopt a more balanced and flexible regulatory approach. These views our guests today, representing our Swedish partner, will also provide us with insight in this regard. Lastly, I would like to highlight the need of collective efforts for the transformation of supply chains according to the ESG criteria. Under EU's broad green transition agenda, it is crucial for both Turkey and EU move forward with increasing cooperation. As a critical economic partner of the EU and the custom union partner, we will also be glad to discuss the main implications and obligations of coming legislation of the companies that are established in Turkey. Dear Ms. Anders' daughter, dear Mr. Wedden, before leaving the floor for your remarks, I would like to thank once again for your kind participation.
Thank you very much. We should be the ones thanking you for inviting us to meet with you today. Well, it's very good that we have Zoom and we can actually meet across countries and that we were not able to do a few years ago. Of course, it would have been even nicer if we could have met in person. Hopefully that will be the next time. Thank you very much also for your remarks. I just wanted to do a very, very short introduction of who we are. So as said, I'm Charlotte Andersdotter, heading the EU office of the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. We are actually the largest employer organization in Sweden, with representing around 60,000 companies in Sweden, with around 2 million employees. So a large number of the Swedish economy that we represent from all different sectors. So not just the more traditional industry, but also services and tourism, etc. You were mentioning the Swedish presidency that just started 10 days ago, something that we have been very active. We actually started already 2 years ago to try to point out what would our priorities from the Confederation, together with our member organizations, what would be the priorities for the Swedish presidency. And we came up with 5, where we think that one of them, of course, will be very neatly tied into what we will discuss today, but our overarching theme that we hope that Sweden will really drive during this 6 months is an increased competitiveness in Europe. We believe that this is something that we have lost, that focus during the last 10 plus years, and we need to get that up on the agenda again. That's why we are very happy to see that the Council actually took that step forward in December and asked the Commission to bring forward a competitiveness strategy during this semester. To come back to our priorities, we see that strong, sustainable competitiveness in Europe will be built on 5 main pillars, whereas one is, of course, to continue to push for the Green Deal. We think that sustainability is a competitiveness advantage for European businesses, but it has to be done in a sensible and pragmatic way. And we will come back to that in a bit. Second priority is the digital translation. These two also go very closely hand in hand. The internal market is the crown jewel of the European collaboration, something that we would like to see highlighted, and also to take away a lot of the red tapes already there. Then, of course, trade for us is super important, not at least in this moment in time. And the last priority is to continue to put effort into research and innovation, which is still our basis for competitive companies. So those are the 5 priorities that we have put forward to our government that we would like to see being highlighted during this 6 months of the Swedish presidency. To come back to your wish of that it should be a more flexible view on legislation and that it maybe should be more pragmatic, we can only cherish your wish. And you can be sure that this is something that we constantly tell our colleagues back in the ministries and also ministers when we meet with them. So we do hope that that will show during our 6 months. When it comes to today's subject, I would like to underline that we were not the ones that came up with this idea, and we are not the ones neither who that are in charge of it. It's the Commission and the co-legislators. However, we would like to give you a view of how we see this, our point of view of this piece of legislation, and also how we think that this could be implemented in, and the effects that it could have on our companies. And just to come back to what you said, you mentioned a lot of different pieces of legislation in this domain. This, I think, is one of our worries, that we are doing legislation at European level without really seeing what the one hand is doing with the other, so that it risks to have overlaps in the different pieces of legislation and initiatives. I will stop there. I thank you again. I will leave the floor to my colleague, Björn, who will introduce himself and also what our opinions about the CSRD. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will actually try to share a PowerPoint with a few slides to you. So let me know if that works out. I don't know if you can see it now.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. All right, I'll put it in. All right, so thank you very much, as Charlotte said, for inviting us to this panel to talk about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Confederation's priorities on the sustainability agenda. My name is Björn Wedin, and I am working on trade policy and CSR issues at the Brussels office of the Confederation, and has done that for a couple of months. And before that, I was based in Stockholm. I will start with just giving a brief background to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, but I will put the most focus on our point of view to this proposal, which is symbolic to what Charlotte just said on the importance of having a pragmatic approach to the legislative proposals that are being put forward within the Green Deal. To start off, the directive is building on the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and it contains larger and more detailed requirements for how businesses are reporting on sustainability, basically. And the scope is vastly extended. And also something new is that auditing on these reports are mandatory, which differs from the past. The number of companies that are included within this legislation is also increased. It goes from 12,000 European companies up to 50,000, which is a big increase. And for Swedish companies, around 1,600 to 2,000 companies are included. And it's also a big increase in Sweden. So a lot of Swedish firms and a lot of our member companies will be affected by this legislation. So practically every listed firm in the European Union will be included in this legislation. That goes for SME companies as well. Larger companies in general, which are not listed, will also be included, and they have to fulfill a couple of criteria, as you said in the beginning, Fatih. Some subsidiaries are exempted from the reporting requirements, because the legislation kind of makes it enables the parent company of a larger company group to be responsible for the reporting, and therefore subsidiaries are exempted, which we think is very good, and I will come back to that. The implementation will happen gradually, starting from next year, the 1st of January 2024, and will go on for companies outside of the European Union, for example, a couple of years later. Regarding on what to report within this new legislation, it must include information on, for example, sustainability policies of the companies, their corporate governance, sustainability risks in the company's daily operations, for example. So the scope here is certainly widened from the non-financial reporting directive, which precedes this legislation. The reporting of the companies will be conducted based on standards that is decided by the Commission through the use of delegated acts, and this we will come back to later, because we see this as a general trend in the EU that more and more legislation are being decided through the use of delegated acts, which sometimes can be problematic. The first set of recommendations of standards that are going to basically decide the practical implementation of this directive was published in the end of November by the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, which are responsible for constructing these standards, and that was foregone by consultation processes where the Confederation was actively participating in. So it is important to realize, or to have in mind, that the directive itself is stipulating the broader framework of the reporting, but it is the standards that are actually going to have the practical effect on Swedish firms. So the work that EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, is doing is very important. And since that will have the most effect, there are some issues that it is delegated acts from the Commission that will decide the practical conditions of this directive, basically. So that was a short overview. And when we talk about how we see this proposal, we have been very active in this file from our experts in Stockholm on company reporting and financial reporting and non-financial reporting. First off, the increased scope and the increased number of companies affected will surely lead to increased costs in administration. So the big question here then becomes, is all the required reporting information relevant if you weigh it against how much time and effort and money that will have to be put in by the firms to provide this information? So this calculation we always have to have this in mind when within this directive. One clear example of this is what was called the rebuttable presumption, which has been fortunately left out of the final proposal compared to the initial one. So this presumption basically stated that all information, according to the stipulated reporting requirements, was relevant to report on for all companies, unless the companies themselves could prove that this wasn't relevant for their specific activities. So by having that presumption, you more or less put the burden of proof on companies, which in addition to the actual reporting itself only brings extra administration to companies. And we think that this stems from a general misbelief in the actions of European firms. So in other words, if you wanted to get rid of the administration of reporting, you had to do some more administration to prove that this wasn't relevant for your firm's operations. But as I said, fortunately, this presumption has been left out, but it is a clear example of how we have to weigh the effort, the time and the money to be put in this administration. We have to weigh it against what good it will actually do towards reaching our sustainability goals. Yes, on the same theme, we also, of course, need to think about what time all the extra administration within this directive takes from the core of the firm's operations. As Charlotte said at the beginning, we see the sustainability agenda as somewhat of a competitive advantage for Swedish firms and for European firms in general. And this is what contributes most to the green transition, that firms have the time and capacity and money to actually focus on their core operations. And this is what really will make the difference in the end. To overburden our companies with administrative tasks, this will only lead to less focus on core operations and therefore less focus on the sustainability agenda. Other input we had, not surprisingly, the standards. A lot of companies will have to report according to this directive for the first time. So obviously the standards has to be concrete. They have to be manageable in terms of numbers. They cannot be too wide and up for subjective for any subjectivity, basically. Furthermore, it is generally positive with harmonizing standards across the European Unions, but financial reporting previously has been decided by global standards. So in the beginning here, before the European standards are converging with global standards, there will be some divergences between the EU and the rest of the world. And this will also, of course, lead to more administration and less smooth non-financial reporting in general. Regarding the actual content of the new reporting and the increased scope that I mentioned in the beginning, there are some problematic elements to them as well. For instance, regarding the corporate governance part of it, and you mentioned, Fatih, in the beginning, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and we have the same critique basically to that proposal, that corporate governance should not be a part of this type of reporting activity or the due diligence activity, because that doesn't have anything to do with the actual goal that we're trying to accomplish here. Lastly, we see, and I think Charlotte will speak a bit more on that just after me here, we see some issues in general with the legislative process of the CSRD, which we also can see in other processes, especially in the sustainability field within the European Union, but also on other policy areas. And it is, for example, the increased use of delegated acts. Those were from the beginning supposed to give technical advice, but they have been increased in scope to include more and more substantial things in them, which could be problematic. And also add to that short consultation processes in general. We see that the legislative agenda is being pushed forward with a very high speed, which gives stakeholders like ourselves not too much time all the time to have the ability to feed into how this will affect those that are being affected by the legislation. In other words, our member companies and European companies. And also, lastly, I think Charlotte will speak on this a bit as well, but the lack of thorough impact assessments. How will this legislation actually, how is it going to fulfill the goals that we have set up, the very ambitious goals that we have set up within the Green Deal? Is this the right way to go? How much will it cost to firms? How much will it take the focus away from the core operations, which we think will do the most positive impact on reaching the ambitious climate goals? So we see this on different policy areas as well, not only in this one, but it is a general problem, and we have to have that in mind going forward. I'll leave to Charlotte again to say some short words.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Björn. Just a little bit on how we see that these things and others come back to what you said, Fatih, in the beginning. Our goal is also to make European companies more competitive. And I think that in this moment of history, this is more urgent than ever. To come back to what has been said earlier also by Björn, we are seriously worried about the lack of impact analysis in the different legislative proposals and files that we see today. And as we said in the beginning, also that they are contradicting each other and they are putting much more burden onto our companies. That won't say that we are against legislation. Sometimes it's easy to say that businesses are just critical to what comes out on when it comes to reaching the Green Deal and the green transition. This is not the case. Legislation can sometimes be very helpful, but it has to be pragmatic and it has to have impact analysis and what consequences will be before you start. This is something that we would like to see ahead. We would also like that the Swedish presidency really take this as a serious remark when it comes to legislation, and put that as a requirement in all future proposals for legislation, that there will be a kind of a competitiveness check. We have actually brought forward, and we can send you the link to that piece of paper, a compass or for competitiveness, what we actually believe is important to regard when it comes to pushing for competitiveness in Europe. A kind of competitiveness check that should be ahead of all new pieces of legislation. And we would really like the Swedish presidency to take this seriously and forward during the 6 months. In the green field, of course, as well as in all other fields, so that we avoid to have double penalties for our businesses when it comes to reporting, and really push for more competitiveness. I think we stop there. We would be more than happy to hear your reactions and your views on this directive, and how we maybe together also can actually push for a better regulation, as the word is saying, and also more pragmatic legislation to actually support our companies to be more sustainable in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte and Björn, for your exceptional presentation of such a complex topic, whereas also mentioning the priorities of business and how it is quite very hard to establish an EU-level legislation, whereas try to balance this with national priorities and also try to support European businesses' competitiveness. And also thank you, Fatih Bey, Chair of TÜSİAD Green Deal Task Force, also for introducing and putting light of the concern of the Turkish businesses on the same areas. Indeed, European Union has one of the most established frameworks around the world on ESG, that is Environment Sustainability and Governance related regulation, and Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of the European Union is one of the latest and most important, maybe, piece of legislation that will change European firms and non-European firms, how they are going to non-EU firms, how they are going to report on these new requirements, but maybe in time it will also affect how the global international framework will maybe follow European Union's path as well. So thank you once more for setting the scene, and maybe although you have summed it up very well, can you perhaps once more try to tell us what are the key action points of CSRD? You have said that CSRD is replacing the current non-financial reporting directive, but what is new for businesses? Can we once more highlight what are these key action points and what is new for businesses? What are the challenges ahead?
You want me to start? Yeah. So first of all, it is the increased scope, I would say, on what to report on. That is the most pressing issue. The number of reporting requirements that was constructed in this latest standard proposals from the EFRAG is 137 to the number, and that is an increased scope. Not everyone will be mandatory for every company, but it is still a very big increase if you compare that to the NFRD. That's the first thing, and also for Swedish firms and for European firms in general, the number of firms that will be included within this legislation is also very much increased, from 12,000 within the NFRD to 50,000 European firms will be included. So that is also one big change. I think, yeah, I think the increased scope and what to report on, and these 137 reporting requirements, it will be a big challenge for Swedish firms to have the time and money and effort to be able to fulfill all these criteria. Some of the larger companies, they have compliance departments, they have big reporting department, and they could probably have the capacity to handle that. But since this also includes listed SMEs and other companies, some of those companies doesn't have the capacity to fulfill this legislation. So they will have to take the time from their core operations to instead do administrative work, which we are not sure will actually help the most towards reaching our ambitious climate goals that we have set up. And this is problematic. And this is what I mentioned before. We have to weigh the need for the information provided in the reporting against how much time, money, and effort that we have to put into it. And we also always have to have in mind what will do the most effect and what will get us fastest to reach the ambitious climate goals that we have set up and that we are fully supportive towards.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Indeed, it is one of the, it will be probably a bigger challenge on small, medium-sized enterprises, but they have a bit of a gradual timeline, if I'm not mistaken, but still, as you have said, this is one of the topics that is very important to consider when we are thinking the administrative burden. I would like to also ask about this. It is, as far as I know, called double materiality approach. That means companies, on the one hand, need to report on their own impact on the environment and sustainability issues. But on the other hand, we also start to see that how climate change or other risks are going to impact businesses are also going to be reported. We see this new approach that now it is called double materiality, or also it's I believe in the EU taxonomy. Can you also mention this? And now this new CSRD comes up with certain long-term vision for businesses. Am I correct? So businesses will need to have a long-term ESG targets and policies, and they will have to have even set clear rules and which departments or divisions will be responsible for this new reporting requirements. So can you also elaborate on these two topics if they are not too much in detail?
I think it's a bit, it's very much in detail, but I think it really comes back to what Björn already said. It becomes a little bit of a race. I mean, it becomes how can I say, double for the companies. So in one hand, if we look at least from our Swedish company side, most of them, I shouldn't go down to every single SME, but at least the companies that we talk about within this piece of legislation, they have very ambitious sustainability goals themselves. I could say that that is probably true for 90% at least of them. If they should also then, I mean, this is what they already do. And we believe that there is a kind of a feeling of mistrust within that actually companies can do these goal setting and visioning themselves, that it's not really the purpose. As Björn said, you have to weigh what would actually be the positive outcome of putting that as a burden that you have to do by legislation, or that is actually already a part of your business plan, because this is what we see. We would rather like to see that you work with maybe other tools to make more companies to enter into this field by themselves, to have these long-term visions about how to come to more ambitious goals, as many of our companies already exceed the European goals. So not to go into the different details, but it's when you put all these different kind of things, as we said earlier, now we're just talking about one piece of legislation, but we already see that there are different layers that will put extra burden, not just of administration in terms of how you have to report, but what you were just talking about, it actually enters into the business's own modeling or planning or visionizing. And this is something that we strongly believe, I think that we can agree, all of us, that this must be continue to be a part of the responsibility of the companies themselves. And if we would like more companies to go that way, well, me personally, I strongly believe that this could be done in other ways than only by legislation. Sometimes legislation can help, but if it goes too far and becomes too detailed, it is counterproductive. I don't know if that was the answer to your question, but at least this is a worry that we see in this legislation and in many others also, that it becomes counterproductive because there will become too many layers for the companies to keep track on, and actually risk to lose their long-term vision, as you were saying.
Definitely. Maybe, Charlotte, you can pick from here to comment also on EU taxonomy, how they interact and differ, because for our audience, it's a bit, we are talking about EU taxonomy reporting requirements, where where European Union is trying to facilitate financing of more sustainable businesses or sustainable actions. But does it really happen? Is it going to really happen? How EU taxonomy is going to work with all of this new reporting requirements? It's very complicated, as you have mentioned, and rightly put the concerns of European business. How you see EU taxonomy, and also we have mentioned corporate sustainable due diligence legislation, which is another piece of legislation where sustainability reporting of value chains are involved. In Turkish, we are calling this legislation because the name is very complex. We say in Turkish, AB değer zincirleri yasa tasarısı. So how all these new reporting requirements interact? You already put your criticism, but maybe you can just put a few more words about them.
Yeah, I will just say a few words, and I will leave it to Björn. I think a general comment here, and that I would very much like to do, is that in general, it's better to have European legislation on something, or that we have a European view on things, than that we start to have national legislations, because that if we would have that in all these files, this would even be then nationally, it would be completely messy. So in general, we are more in favorable of having a unified view on things. Then it becomes national legislations of the parts that you were talking about, whether it is this CSRD, or if it's the due diligence, or whatever it is. It's better. So just to make that clear, because otherwise it would be even more confusing and more difficult for anyone. And that also goes from, I think that we could more or less all agree that the basis for these different pieces of legislation, as you just mentioned, is not bad. It is more about how this has been translated into actions and into what we expect for the implementation. Here are where we have our criticism. So to put more incentives into having financing into sustainability is good. It's more of how this has been then interpreted into the taxonomy. And again, where we find with that is, as what Björn said, with the delegated acts, that it's not really going the way that we normally see for the legislative processes. Same goes with the due diligence. The basis of that, the thinking, is not bad. It's more of how this has been then transformed into a proposal for a new legislation. But maybe, Björn, you would like to say a few words on how this potentially two different pieces of legislation with the taxonomy could, and the due diligence, what we see from our perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to draw a parallel with the trade area, which is my home turf, so to speak, where the EU and the European Commission lately have been putting forward very much unilateral instruments that will apply towards third countries outside of the European Union. Take the CBAM, for example. Take the anti-coercion instrument, the foreign subsidies instrument, the national procurement instrument. There are a lot of unilateral instruments coming from the European Union that, as Charlotte said, we support the purpose of most of them, but we also have to have in mind the cumulated and aggregate effect of all these instruments and what they will have towards our partners outside the European Union. Because if you take them one by one and look at them, yes, the purpose is good. Sometimes they have flaws in how they are being constructed and how they are going to be implemented later. But all in all, if you look at them one by one, we could see them as useful and necessary. But if you take them as a whole, and this I think goes for the entire sustainability agenda as well, if you put the taxonomy, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and if you put them and measure the cumulative effect on administration, on relations towards third countries that wants to do business with the European Union, that we need to do business with the European Union, how will this affect, how big will this effect be? And we are afraid on the trade area at least, and I think this goes for the sustainability area as well, that this will scare off potential partners outside the European Union to make trade with the EU because it's too hard. It requires too much administrative work. And that is not what we want in these times of geopolitical instability. We need our partners outside the European Union. And then we also have to have the third country dimension in mind. So this certainly goes for the sustainability agenda as well. How, if you put them all together, what will the actual effect be, both to our companies and to Swedish firms, but also to companies that wants to do business on the single market and with the EU?
And if I can just add on one thing on that, the trade perspective is extremely important, as well as the investment perspective. What we actually need very badly now is to continue to invest in new technologies, in more greening, in more sustainability. And as Björn very well says, is that if it becomes the accumulated effects of all these different pieces of legislation, that might in the basis be not too bad, but if you put them all together and also the outcome of them, that would hamper both our partner countries outside of the European Union to want to invest in the single market, as well as our companies already on the single market. They might even seek themselves outside, not because they don't want to continue to work on sustainability and wants to continue to come up with new solutions to really reach the goals, but rather that it will become too complicated. So then the whole purpose of this exercise is actually going away. So I think that the trade perspective is very important, and together with the investments, and then we come back to the taxonomy. And then just a last thing on that is also that we still believe that it should be as far as possible technology neutral when it comes to investments, because we cannot predict today what tomorrow's technologies would be. So it's also, you have to have a balance here on how much you can predict for the future, in what kind of technologies, what kind of solutions, not always technologies, but a combination of different new innovations that will actually help us to reach the goals faster. So this is just to summarize that what we see and our fears. It's not that the idea per se is not bad, but it is then how it's becoming transformed into legislation and implementation.
Thank you, Charlotte and Björn. Indeed, European Business Europe, as members of Business Europe, very actively follows up on this topic, and as your own organization as well. So hopefully businesses' interests and concerns will be heard over time more. Before giving floor to Fatih Bey, I would like to quickly go back to our audience and get their questions. One of the questions is about how are there any good practice suggestions, particularly when supply chain risks assessments are being made? Maybe we can share any resources after after the presentation, after our webinar. Also regarding this new standards, because you have mentioned, Björn, that EFRAG has put this European standards, and reporting will be based on them, and they are equally important, ESRS draft standards. So when can we think the timeline will end and when they will be finalized? Maybe a few briefly mention on that and mention this perhaps. And also regarding the CSRD requirements, how non-EU firms are going to be in the timeline and how they are going to be affected. These are the last questions. Thank you so much.
I can start with the standards. The understanding that I have is that one first draft was submitted to the Commission late November, and these were the broad standards. This will be followed up during the spring with the sector-specific standards, and also more specified standards on how third countries will adhere to the legislation. So that's the short answer to the timeline that I'm aware of and that I've heard. Regarding the third countries in general and how when they will be included within the legislation, as you said earlier, and as I also mentioned, it will be a gradual implementation for third countries. I think around 2028, I think will be the year, but I'm not really sure, so I have to get back to you on that. But it is interesting because third country companies doesn't have to be based on the single market to be included within the scope, because if a parent undertaking in a third country has a subsidiary which is based on the single market and is included within the scope of this legislations, the parent undertaking is responsible for conducting the sustainability report. So that obviously has large implications also for companies outside the European Union. Or of course also companies from third countries that is based on the single market will be affected by this. But then it is the timeline that I just mentioned that will start to be implemented in a couple of years.
Yeah, and then there was a question also on some good practices. I think we maybe could come back with a few examples. In general, I would say that, and as we mentioned earlier, most of our member companies, they are very well aware of both trying to look into their value chains and their own operations, of course, that it should strive for being so sustainable as possible in all different parts. A value chain is, of course, much more difficult to control because it also depends on how deep you will go into and what you actually mean by a value chain. I think that this is something that is still to be debated. But in general, I would say that there is an willing and the goal actually from most, the vast majority of our companies is to try to get this in order for their own sake, because they know that customers will still require this from them. So the kind of the market-driven effect is very powerful in this regard. But we could probably come back with a few examples on this.
Before giving the floor to Fatih Bey, we have 1 more minute and one last questions about Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, and how this CSRD differs from that. Maybe we can say that European Union new reporting standards will be much more, deeper in scope. Would you agree with that?
I don't know too much about the GRI, not much at all, in fact, but that tends to be the case, that the EU goes a bit further than the rest. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So thank you for your exceptional presentation. I would like to give the floor back to Fatih Bey for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Charlotte and Björn. Today, we had the opportunity to evaluate the scope and the possible effects of the corporate sustainability reporting directive with our estimated guests. The transformation process triggered by the EU will definitely impact other geographies and change the traditional flow of trade towards ESG criteria. However, green transformation and sustainability are in the focus of many sectors and companies in the global competitive environment. It will be critical to have a collective effort to eliminate possible risks on the value chains. In this context, I consider it important that the global initiatives are managed transparently by increasing international cooperation in this field. We would like to thank all our participants and our guests once more for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Zeynep Hanım, çok teşekkür ediyorum. Güzel bir gün diliyorum size ve tüm arkadaşlara.
Çok teşekkürler Fatih Bey, size de.
İyi günler, teşekkürler.
İyi günler, teşekkür ederim.